Welcome to the Hidden History of Business. I'm Frank Hutchison. Today we're going to be discussing how beer and Shakespeare go together in ways you may not expect.
We've been talking about beer for the last few episodes. Recently I watched a couple of documentaries about beer in the Middle Ages and discovered a few chain reactions that I had never realized were connected. You guys know who controlled beer in the Middle Ages was mostly the monk. I mean, this increase, they were scholars, so they actually devoted time and study to beer making, and they wrote everything down. On top of that, because monks were the repositories of the libraries and great documents of Christianity, they had access to the ancient documents from Alexandria and the Egyptian areas, where beer had been so incredibly popular and well documented for so long.
And that's important because Alexandria, for example, was had one of the greatest libraries in the world.
It did, and people wrote things down, especially something that was so important for their economy and basic everyday life. But because they could write things down, the monks developed quality control. They recorded recipes, they could record the results of each batch, which led to them developing, even though they didn't realize what was happening, they knew that if they cleaned their instruments, their beer didn't go as sour or go bad as quickly. So they started really stressing the importance of cleaning and hygiene, and they experimented with different additives, and finally it was the monks who started adding hops to their beer, which is so important because hops are a preservative. They make beer last a really long time, and that's because when you boil hops are these tall kind of viney plants that are technically related to cannabis. Go figure. But when you take the hops and you boil them in the course of making beer, it actually eats up the chemical that helps contribute to the growth of bacteria. So you add hops to beer when you're making it, the beer doesn't go bad as quickly. This is when beer shifted from being this very sweet drink to being a little more bitter, because that's what hops did to it. They all had these recipes. In fact, in 822 is the first time that an abbot wrote down that they had used hops that we know of. And the funny thing is they didn't really become popular until the 1500s, and they were actually outlawed in England in 1471. The English weren't a fan of beer. So when you add hops to whatever you're brewing, it becomes beer. Otherwise, it's ale.
Okay, now hold a moment. You're saying it was written down 1822?
822. Sorry, 822. So in 822, you can edit that.
Yes.
Yeah. So in 822 is when it was written down. That's how you turn ale into beer. You add hops, it's beer. Without hops, it's ale. The British really liked their ale because it was sweeter than beer that had hops in it. They didn't want it to be bitter like that. So they actually outlawed it for brewing in 1471.
So was this made from grains?
It was made from whatever grains were available, but usually you had rye, barley. It was almost always malted.
So we're not talking about like mead from honey or fruit juices. This is still strictly grain.
This is strictly grain.
Okay.
And actually stepping back a little bit. So by the beer kind of reaches its peak in Europe in the 1300s. Okay. Let me find the exact data. In 1200 AD, thousands of monasteries are selling ale in Europe, just thousands and thousands of them. Well, around 1300, the local governments figure out that they can tax beer. And suddenly you drop from having thousands of monasteries to only having a few hundred in all of Europe that are actually selling and creating beer. But the plus is that led to the commercialization. People guarded their secrets a little more carefully. That leads to more regulation, the taxation, until eventually 1471, the British outlaw hops because everyone wants to have ale instead. And it was also an anti-German move because of the political issues at the time. They didn't want to encourage all of those German brewers who liked their beer to come to England because they were very, very xenophobic at the time. Well, that didn't last for long. People started to, really like beer. Queen Elizabeth had 2 brewers on staff, so they brewed both ale and beer for her, and it became more and more popular. Now, back then, the standard was 6 to 8 pints per day. And it became even more popular.
That's per person.
Per person.
That they would drink.
Yes, that they would drink.
Okay.
Yes.
So
and it was
that's
even
like a gallon a
yes.
day.
Children all the way up to
adults. Yep, everyone. And the monks really enjoyed having it. This is actually a loophole they got around because they were required to fast on certain days of the year. Important feast days, holidays. But beer was not considered food. So if you had beer, you could drink it, you could have sustenance for the day, but technically still be fasting. And once the monks figured this out, a lot of other people figured this out too. So beer and ale were extremely popular because it was sustenance. You could get around this requirement the church had put in place and still be a pious person. Beer had always been very sweet and cloudy, but hops were making them bitter and clear. And people started experimenting because they weren't sure what was the preservative. So they would add everything. We have records of them using rats, chicken entrails, pine trees, bark, herbs, heather. They were all experimenting, trying to find ways to make it taste better and last longer. The hops were finally hit on because they're the one thing that could be cultivated. You could actually purposely grow hops to use for beer. And that's why they really caught on with the monasteries that had this extra land and they had gardens, because here was something they didn't have to go foraging for. They could cultivate it themselves. It just so happened that it was also one of the best preservatives they could find. It really took off in Germany. The British Isles resisted. And we really see this in Shakespeare's plays. This cracks me up. And I know Emily and I both studied Shakespeare pretty in depth. I know you've been to Stratford-upon-Avon. Yep. I studied with the American Shakespeare Company in high school. Shakespeare hated beer. Every mention of beer in his plays are completely derogatory. And he talks about ale all the time. Like it's in Two Gentlemen of Verona. When Launce is listing the virtues of women, one of them is that she brews good ale. Blessing on your heart, you brew good ale, is one of the proverbs they say. And the one character in the plays who really drinks a lot of beer is Thomas Horner, who's the armorer in Henry VI. Which was written about 1590, maybe a little later, but that's about when they think it was. And he's so drunk on beer that his apprentice, Peter Thump, is able to overcome him and kill him in their duel. That is the fate of people who drink beer in Elizabethan England. And we know it wasn't the most popular thing, but what I didn't know is one of the reasons Shakespeare probably had strong feelings about drink is that his father was an ale conner. Do you guys know what that is?
No.
Tell.
Starting in the Middle Ages, every town in England had a conner who was the official ale tester. And it was a very important position. It was almost a testing ground for greater leadership in the town. Shakespeare's dad, after being a successful conner, went on to be an alderman. He was the chamberlain for the borough. This was a huge position of authority, and you took a sacred oath to go in and taste all of the ale to determine its quality.
A sacred oath.
A sacred oath, which was also kind of a risky oath, okay? Mm-hmm. These men had the power to lower the price of ale if they thought it was poor quality. They could report breweries that were substandard or engaged in fraudulent, underhanded practices. They could fine people running public houses that were watering things down. There's a completely apocryphal story that's been proven to not be true, but for centuries people told this tale that conners would go in, they'd order a cup of beer, and then they would pour it on a bench, and they would sit on the bench. And better quality beer and ale would be sticky when they stood up. So if they stuck a little bit, then they knew that it was good quality. And that's how they would test it with their leather pants. And this is kind of ridiculous because no one was going to ruin their leather pants that way. Right. But this mythology kind of built up around the conners as the profession eventually went by the wayside.
So they were sort of the Food and Drug Administration for their day.
They were, with a lot more risk, because the Food and Drug Administration didn't have to actually physically taste the potentially contaminated food. And that's the thing. Even if it smelled horrible, even if it was in horrible condition and could kill you, Shakespeare's father, John, still had to taste the ale.
Brave man.
It was a very dangerous job. I mean, if the ale was too sour, if it was contaminated, you could die drinking it. And that was his job. And it did progress. I mean, he was appointed the official ale taster in 1556, around the time he got married. We don't know how long he held it, but he very quickly went on. 2 years later, he was the borough constable, which is like an early policeman. Mm-hmm. A few years later, he was the efferer, which is the guy who doles out penalties for crimes that are not on the statute books, so things that local people decide are a crime, almost like civil court. And then by 1561, he was the borough chamberlain, the alderman, the chief alderman. This was a huge position of power. This is how the local town started regulating beer and ale. Now, eventually, beer started catching on, but it took a while, and I'll go over that in the next episode. If you'd like to learn more about the subject that we discussed today, you can find multimedia content, links to articles we discussed, and videos on our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business and on Twitter as well. Thanks for listening.